The whistle of bullets cut through the frozen November air like invisible knives. French General Antoine-Charles Louis Lassalle, commander of the prestigious 10th Chasseurs à Cheval Regiment, watched in disbelief from his elevated position as the ranks of his dragoons began to crumble. It wasn't the massive fire of infantry that was tearing apart his formation. It was something far more unexpected and deadly. Spanish riders firing from the saddle with devastating precision. Miguel gritted his teeth as he reloaded his Spanish carbine model 1786 without stopping his horse. Around him, the men of the Royal Carabineros Brigade executed the same maneuver with perfect synchronization. The dry sound of bolts echoed like a war drum. From his mount, the young soldier from Extremadura watched as another French dragoon fell from his horse, struck by the accurate fire of his companions. The French had gravely underestimated the Spanish cavalry. On November 28, 1808, in the vicinity of Sepúlveda, in the heart of Castile, a battle was being fought that would change the perception of Napoleonic forces about their Iberian enemies. What had begun as a routine operation for the French imperial troops had become a tactical nightmare. The Spaniards weren't simply resisting, they were winning. The carbine Miguel held in his hands was no ordinary weapon. With a barrel of barely 90 centimeters, shorter than infantry muskets, it had been designed specifically to be fired from the saddle. While French dragoons relied primarily on their sabers and pistols for mounted combat, Spanish carabineros had perfected the deadly art of cavalry fire. The battle had begun 3 hours earlier, when French columns under General Lassalle had detected Spanish movement on the roads leading to Sepúlveda. Confident in his numerical superiority and the invincible reputation of his regiments, Lassalle had ordered an aggressive advance. His 10th Chasseurs à Cheval and 9th Dragoons represented the best of Napoleonic cavalry, veterans of Austerlitz and Jena. Facing Spanish cavalry seemed a mere formality. However, Spanish commander Carlos María de Alvear had meticulously planned his response. Together with the Alcantara and Montese cavalry regiments, the Royal Carabineros Brigade had strategically positioned itself on favorable terrain. The gentle hills of the region allowed rapid cavalry movement while offering partial cover against enemy fire. It was the perfect scenario to demonstrate the tactical effectiveness of Spanish carbines. 3 weeks before Sepúlveda, in a Spanish camp near Aranda de Duero, the men of the Royal Carabineros Brigade prepared for what everyone knew would be inevitable, the clash with Napoleonic forces advancing from the north. Commander Alvear had gathered his officers in an improvised campaign tent to discuss strategy. "Gentlemen," Alvear began, unfolding a rough map on a wooden table, "the French believe they dominate the art of cavalry warfare. They think their mass charges are invincible." He paused, looking at the weathered faces of his captains. "They're about to discover they're wrong." The officers exchanged determined glances. All had seen the devastating Napoleonic victories in Europe, but they also knew they possessed something unique. The Spanish carbine model 1786 had been introduced into the Spanish army 2 decades earlier, designed specifically for cavalry. Unlike the French equivalent weapons, which were essentially shortened muskets with mediocre accuracy, the Spanish carbine had been conceived from the beginning as a mounted firearm. Its shorter barrel didn't excessively sacrifice precision thanks to superior internal design. Raphael, now a sergeant after 15 years of service, supervised the training of younger recruits, including Miguel. The key isn't just in the weapon, it's in the rider. An infantry soldier can rest his musket, breathe calmly, aim with ease. We must do all that on top of a 500-kilogram animal that's moving. The recruits listened with absolute attention. The training was rigorous and merciless. Each morning, before dawn, the carabineros practiced firing from the saddle at stationary targets, then at moving targets, finally shooting while they themselves were moving. The complete process of loading, aiming, and firing had to be completed in less than 30 seconds while simultaneously controlling the mount. Many recruits failed. Those who succeeded became lethal weapons. Miguel had arrived at the regiment 3 months earlier, a 22-year-old peasant from lands near Caceres. His father had been a shepherd, and Miguel had grown up riding since he could walk. That familiarity with horses had caught the attention of the recruiters. But herding sheep through Extremaduran hills was radically different from firing a firearm from a moving horse while the enemy returned fire. "Concentration, Miguel," Raphael constantly reprimanded him during training. "Your left hand controls the horse. Your right hand controls the carbine. Both must work as if they were one." Miguel practiced until his arms ached, until he could reload the carbine almost by instinct, without needing to look at his hands. Constant repetition was converting complex actions into muscle memory. The ammunition also required special preparation. Each paper cartridge contained a measured charge of gunpowder and a spherical lead ball. The regiment's armorers inspected each batch with meticulous attention. An incorrect charge could cause the weapon to explode in the shooter's hands, or, equally dangerous, fail completely when most needed. Each rider's life depended on the quality of his ammunition. The horses received equally intense training. The animals had to get accustomed to the deafening blast of carbines firing next to their ears. Trainers began with distant shots, gradually approaching over weeks, until the horses remained completely impassive while their riders fired from the saddle. It was a slow, patient process that couldn't be rushed without risking permanently ruining the animals. On November 15th, the news everyone had been waiting for arrived. French forces under General Lasalle were moving south, sweeping away Spanish resistance with ruthless ease. The French 10th Chasseurs à Cheval had gained terrifying fame throughout Europe. Their devastating charges had broken Prussian lines at Jena, dispersed Austrians at Austerlitz. Now they were coming for Spain. Commander Alvear convened a war council. Beside him were the commanders of the Alcantara and Montesa regiments, two of the oldest and most prestigious cavalry units in the Spanish army. "We cannot face them in direct charge," Alvear admitted without ambiguity. "Their horses are bigger, their riders more experienced in that type of combat, but we have something they don't have: mounted fire discipline." The plan was risky. It required Spanish riders to maintain calm under extreme pressure, executing precise maneuvers while bullets and sabers sought their lives. The Alcantara and Montesa regiments would provide the mass of traditional cavalry, but the Royal Carabineros would be the spearhead, the hammer that would strike the French in ways they had never experienced. The morning fog was beginning to dissipate when the first French formations became clearly visible. General Lasalle rode at the front of his column, his blue uniform adorned with golden braids that reflected the weak light of the winter dawn. To his right, the 10th Chasseurs à Cheval advanced in impeccable formation, each rider separated exactly at the regulation distance. To his left, the dragoons of the 9th Regiment presented an intimidating mass of men and war horses. "Spanish cavalry ahead, General," a scout officer reported, pointing toward Spanish positions on the low hills. Lasalle smiled with disdain. He had faced and defeated the best cavalry that Austria and Prussia could offer. The Spaniards, however brave, did not represent a significant challenge in his estimation. "Charge formation," he ordered simply. French cornets transmitted the order down the lines. From his position, Commander Alvear observed the French deployment with a critical eye. The French were doing exactly what he had anticipated: a massive frontal charge designed to crush Spanish resistance through pure weight and momentum. It was the tactic that had worked on dozens of battlefields throughout Europe. But today, they faced something different. "Carabineros, prepare for mounted fire," Alvear ordered. The command flowed through the Spanish ranks. Miguel felt his hands sweat inside his leather gloves as he firmly gripped his carbine. The familiar weight of the weapon comforted him. He had practiced this moment hundreds of times. Now it was real. The French began their advance at a trot. The blue formations moved as a single entity, a wall of men in steel approaching inexorably. The earth trembled under the hooves of hundreds of horses. It was a vision designed to terrify, to break the enemy's morale before the first blow was struck. Less disciplined soldiers would have fled. The Royal Carabineros remained motionless. "Hold formation!" Raphael shouted, his voice cutting through the tension. "Let them approach! Remember your training!" Miguel breathed deeply, controlling the impulse to fire prematurely. Distance was critical. Too far, and the bullets would lose effectiveness. Too close, and the French would reach them before they could reload. At 300 meters, the French accelerated to half-gallop, their sabers unsheathed in unison, the metallic sound resonating like a single deadly musical note. It was the traditional moment where the enemy should respond with their own charge. But the Spaniards did not move. They remained in their positions, carbines raised, waiting. At 200 meters, Lasalle frowned. Something was wrong. The Spanish cavalry wasn't charging, nor were they fleeing. They simply waited in disturbingly silent formation. For the first time that morning, a flash of uncertainty crossed his mind. But it was already too late to change tactics. His regiments were committed to the charge. "Fire!" Alvear roared when the French reached 150 meters. The command was repeated by captains and sergeants along the Spanish line. 300 carbines spat fire and lead simultaneously.
The roar was deafening, a wave of sound that rolled through the valley. Gunpowder smoke instantly created a gray cloud that partially obscured the field. The effect on the French formation was devastating. Dozens of riders fell from their mounts, struck by bullets that found flesh before they could even comprehend what was happening. Riderless horses ran crazed. The impeccable formation disintegrated in sections, gaps appearing where moments before there had been a continuous line. Miguel had no time to admire the effect of his shot. His hands were already working on reloading, executing the procedure he had practiced to exhaustion. Bite the cartridge, pour the powder, insert the ball, tamp with the ramrod, prime the pan, all while maintaining control of his horse with his knees. 30 seconds. He had sworn it would never take more than 30 seconds. The surviving French, confused but still deadly dangerous, continued their charge. Now they were at 100 meters. "Controlled retreat!" Raphael shouted. The Royal Carabineros executed a movement practiced 1,000 times. They turned their mounts as a single unit and withdrew at half-gallop, maintaining distance from the French while completing the reload. Lasalle couldn't believe what he was seeing. The Spaniards weren't fleeing in panic. They were withdrawing in orderly fashion, maintaining cohesion of their formation, and they were reloading while riding. It was a maneuver of extreme difficulty that required years of training. His own riders could never execute something similar. At 150 meters, the Royal Carabineros turned in their saddles and discharged a second volley. Another wave of French fell. Miguel saw his bullet impact the chest of a chasseur. The man fell backward over his mount's rump before sliding to the ground. He felt no triumph, only the urgent need to reload again. The French charge had completely lost its momentum. What had begun as a coordinated assault by elite cavalry had become disorganized groups of riders desperately seeking to close distance with an enemy who refused to fight according to traditional rules. Each time they approached, another volley repelled them, leaving more bodies on the frozen ground. The turning point. Commander Alvear evaluated the battlefield with calculated satisfaction. His plan was working better than expected. The French were disorganized, bleeding, confused. It was time to introduce the second phase. He raised his arm, the signal the Alcántara and Montesa regiments had been waiting for. The Spanish cavalry formations on the flanks began their advance. Now the French faced a tactical nightmare. The Royal Carabineros continued their punishment from the center, while fresh Spanish cavalry appeared on both flanks. Lasalle tried to reorganize his formations, but the constant fire of the carbines made it impossible to maintain any cohesion. His officers were falling, orders couldn't be transmitted effectively, panic began to infiltrate the ranks. The battle had taken a turn that no French general had experienced before in the entire peninsular campaign. The Spaniards weren't just resisting, they were dominating combat through a combination of superior armament and innovative tactics that the French didn't know how to counter. Miguel reloaded his carbine for the 13th time that morning. His arms ached from repetitive effort, his throat was dry from dust and smoke, but his movements remained precise and controlled. Raphael wrote nearby, shouting encouragement and orders in equal measure. The veteran sergeant had received a superficial cut on his left arm, but seemed not to notice as he continued directing the coordinated discharge of his section. General Lasalle finally understood the magnitude of his error. He had completely underestimated the Spaniards. His intelligence reports had described Spanish cavalry as brave but undisciplined, capable of heroic charges but undisorganized. What he faced now was radically different. A cavalry force that combined mobility with sustained firepower, something that French military doctrines hadn't contemplated. "Regroup on the North Hill," Lasalle ordered through cornets. It was a tactical retreat, though no French officer would dare call it that openly. The 10th Chasseurs à Cheval, reduced to less than two-thirds of its effective strength, began withdrawing toward an elevated position where they could reorganize. The 9th Dragoons followed, leaving behind dozens of fallen comrades. Commander Alvear immediately recognized what Lasalle was attempting. An orderly retreat to high ground would allow the French to regroup, receive potential reinforcements, and transform the battle into a static siege. He could not allow it. It was time to transform tactical victory into complete French defeat. "Alcantara and Montesa, general charge!" Alvear roared. The two line cavalry regiments that had been successfully pressing the French flanks now launched into a coordinated charge. It wasn't a suicidal charge against prepared formations, but a calculated assault against a disorganized and demoralized enemy. It was the moment they had been waiting for throughout the battle.
The Lancers of the Montesa Regiment struck first at the French left flank. Their 3-meter lances reached the dragoons before they could effectively deploy their sabers. The impact was devastating. French riders were knocked from their mounts, pierced by Spanish lances that had been reintroduced into the Spanish army precisely for this type of combat. The Alcantara Regiment executed a brilliant enveloping movement, surrounding the French right flank and cutting the retreat line toward the North Hill. The French now faced pressure from 3 directions: sustained carbine fire from the front, lancers on their left, and line cavalry cutting their escape to the right. The French formation collapsed completely. Miguel witnessed an act of extraordinary bravery that would remain etched in his memory forever. A young French officer, no older than 25, desperately tried to rally the remains of his squadron for a final charge. He managed to gather perhaps 20 riders, what remained of a company that had begun the day with more than 100 men. With a war cry, they charged directly at the Royal Carabineros lines. It was an act of suicidal courage. Raphael ordered another discharge. The 20 carbines of his section fired simultaneously. Half the French fell instantly. The survivors, including the young French officer, continued their charge. Miguel felt involuntary admiration for the desperate courage of those men, even as he reloaded to shoot them again. The French officer reached the Spanish lines. His saber gleamed under the midday sun as he cut toward Raphael. The veteran Spanish sergeant blocked the blow with his carbine barrel, which broke from the impact. For a moment frozen in time, the two men looked directly into each other's eyes, each seeing in the other both enemy and equal simultaneously. Then Miguel fired, and the French officer fell from his horse. Raphael looked at his destroyed carbine with genuine sadness. 15 years together, he murmured, referring to the weapon. But there was no time for laments. He picked up the saber of the fallen French officer and shouted, "Forward!" The Royal Carabineros, having exhausted their effective ammunition, now charged with unsheathed sabers. It was the final blow against a broken enemy. Victory and legacy. Lasalle watched his world crumble. The Spaniards had executed a perfect tactical campaign.
First, disorganize through sustained fire. Then envelop with fresh cavalry. Finally, finish with a saber charge. It was a symphony of military destruction that the best generals in Paris would have admired, except that now it was being directed against the French army. The French retreat became a rout. Groups of French riders fled in all directions, abandoning equipment, weapons, even wounded mounts. The Spaniards pursued them relentlessly. It wasn't personal revenge, but military necessity. A defeated but not destroyed enemy could regroup and fight another day. All they needed a decisive victory. Miguel pursued a group of French dragoons fleeing toward the nearby forest. His Extremaduran horse, lighter and more agile than the heavy French war horses, was rapidly gaining ground. But instead of killing, Miguel shouted in rudimentary French, "Surrender life!" The French, exhausted and without hope, threw down their weapons. They were defeated men, not monsters, and Miguel remembered his officers' teachings about honorable treatment of prisoners. In 3 hours of combat, Napoleonic forces had suffered a devastating defeat. The Spaniards had proven that cavalry armed with carbines, employed with appropriate tactical doctrine and exceptional discipline, could defeat the best shot cavalry formations France could deploy. It was a lesson that would reverberate throughout the Peninsular War. As the sun began to descend that afternoon, the battlefield of Sepúlveda told its silent story. Bodies of men and horses marked the lines where the most intense combat had occurred. The Spaniards established improvised field hospitals, treating their own wounded and French prisoners alike. In 3 hours of combat, Napoleonic forces had suffered a devastating defeat. The Spaniards had proven that cavalry armed with carbines, employed with appropriate tactical doctrine and exceptional discipline, could defeat the best shock cavalry formations France could deploy. It was a lesson that would reverberate throughout the Peninsular War. As the sun began to descend that afternoon, the battlefield of Sepúlveda told its silent story. Bodies of men and horses marked the lines where the most intense combat had occurred. The Spaniards established improvised field hospitals, treating their own wounded and French prisoners alike. Raphael, his arm finally properly bandaged, sat beside Miguel, sharing a canteen of wine. "They'll remember this day in Paris," Raphael said quietly. "They'll remember that Spaniards can fight, can win." Miguel nodded, too exhausted for words. He had survived his first real battle. His Spanish carbine, blackened by gunpowder, rested on his knees. It was more than a weapon now. It was the symbol of a victory that would change French perception of the war in Spain. Historical impact. The Battle of Sepúlveda demonstrated that the era of pure shot cavalry was ending. The future belonged to mounted formations that could combine mobility with firepower, a concept that would eventually evolve into the mechanized units of the 20th century. The Royal Carabineros at Sepúlveda were precursors of this transformation. Final casualties painted an impressive picture. The French 10th Chasseurs lost nearly 200 men. The 9th Dragoons suffered similar losses, while Spanish casualties across 3 regiments totaled approximately 80 men. More important than numbers was the psychological impact. For the first time in the Peninsula Campaign, a French general described Spanish cavalry not as a minor obstacle, but as a serious threat, particularly highlighting the deadly effectiveness of Spanish carbines and the exceptional discipline of the riders who wielded them. The Spanish carbine model 1786 became the most sought-after weapon by mounted units throughout Spain. Alvear's tactics were codified in official army manuals. The legacy of Sepúlveda would influence cavalry doctrine for decades, proving that innovation, training, and courage combined could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. The end.